Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you all in beautiful Tallinn. I want to begin by thanking our hosts at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence for convening this, the 15th CyCon. The contributions the center has made to our strategic thinking on cyber are immense. From conducting the largest live fire cyber exercise in the world, Lock Shields, to sponsoring the development of the Tallinn Manual and its successor, the center has proved its value to the alliance and to the interests of all states that want to increase global cyber stability. Of course, the center would not exist without the foresight of our other hosts today, our colleagues from Estonia. I am always impressed when I remember that Estonia first proposed a cyber center of excellence in 2003. Thank you to all of the Estonians who helped make CyCon a success. I couldn't ask for a more gracious welcome. Yet, even as we celebrate the 15th iteration of this conference, we have also just marked the 16th anniversary of the politically motivated attacks on Estonia in 2007. As we all know, the timing was not a coincidence. It was in the aftermath of this broad spectrum cyber attack that NATO created the center, and we entered the age of modern cyber warfare. NATO and Estonia took the urgency of that moment in 2007 and converted it into long-term momentum that has made all of us far more capable cyber actors. Today, of course, the same strategic adversary is threatening peace and prosperity once again. Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine last year and its continuing invasion has upended our calculus within the cyber domain and more broadly. I know it goes without saying in this room that we all stand with the Ukrainian people as they show the world the true meaning of bravery and resilience. The biggest miscalculation that Putin made was underestimating the power of the people in the face of this skullduggery. We all continue to support Ukraine through its struggle in the face of the incalculable damage in lives and in blatant destruction that the Russians have wrought. Sadly, we live in a dangerous world, for even as Russian revanchism has precipitated a land war in Europe, we also collectively face a pacing threat, the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China's increasingly bellicose activity and efforts to mature its armed forces mean that we have to prepare to forestall future conflict, even as we support our Ukrainian partners in their ongoing war. But none of this is news to this audience, nor is the strategic context confined to the cyber domain. So, for my talk today, I want to turn your gaze inward to your own governments and their efforts to control cyber risk. I hope to share some of my thoughts on why the work of my organization, the Office of the National Cyber Director, is essential to our military readiness and may inform your own missions. And I want to tie that mission assurance in with the larger cyber ecosystem and give you some insights from President Biden's newly released National Cybersecurity Strategy as to why ministries of defense should be at the forefront of efforts to seize the initiative from our adversaries by defining our own positive vision of what cyberspace should be. To start, I invite us all to consider how the cyber domain differs from others. To some extent, the answer is not very much at all. After all, it was the first Tallinn manual that helped pave the way for the Wales Declaration, which says that international law applies in cyberspace. In many respects, cyber is just another domain. I'll be the first to tell you there's a lot we can learn by taking lessons from other areas of policy, whether in the military sphere or otherwise. However, there are some key areas where cyber is different. Not necessarily a bad thing, as it keeps us all employed. Essential to that difference is the role that the private sector plays in the cyber domain, especially for cybersecurity and especially for a nation's critical infrastructure. The terrain of cyberspace is largely owned and operated under the rules set by the private sector. That simple fact is hugely important for our doctrine and how we think about concepts like maneuvering. But it's not just the ownership of the links that makes the navigating the domain challenging. We are all used to the private companies being a key component of our national defense. After all, it's the companies of our respective defense industrial bases that make the platforms that we rely on, and who engage in critical research and development to maintain our tactical edge. It is those companies that are providing the material supporting Ukraine's valiant fight. As governments, we recognize that these defense companies have a special status in our security hierarchy. We recognize them as critical infrastructure integral to our national defense and national security. And we are used to working hand in glove with them on matters like protection of classified data, an issue of immense concern for decades predating digitalization. The advent of the information age raised the degree of difficulty as more and more data are shared back and forth. But the fundamental tenets of working with clear defense contractors to protect sensitive information has not changed. What has changed is the proliferation of sensitive but unclassified information shared throughout complex supply chains. And what has also changed is the ability of adversaries to process data at scale, to take seemingly disparate unclassified data elements and reconstruct classified information from them. 30 years ago, physically breaking into dozens of defense subcontractors' offices to make off with reams of paper and then somehow making sense of it all would have been a massive intelligence operation. Today, it's done in a matter of a few clicks. In the United States, we have recognized this supply chain cybersecurity problem. We are working to impose contracting requirements to ensure that anyone processing sensitive data, whether a first-tier supplier or a sixth-tier one, meet appropriate and necessary information security requirements. Our Department of Defense's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, program seeks to bring a harmonized approach to the hundreds of thousands of suppliers we rely upon. And while we're making progress, it is a very thorny challenge. I use the defense industrial base example because the confidentiality of our state secrets and intellectual property is something we can all relate to, and it illustrates that we can work together with the private sector in the interest of our national defense. But a breach of confidentiality is just one of the consequences we worry about. As disruptive and destructive cyber attacks increasingly proliferate, whether through state-sponsored actions like NotPetya or the scourge of ransomware, we increasingly think about threats to the integrity and availability of key systems. And for the purposes of mission assurance, that means working closely with private sector critical infrastructure owners and operators to ensure the security, protection, and resilience of their systems. In the United States, we are increasingly focused on mitigating vulnerabilities to the civil and commercial infrastructure that we depend on to enable defense operations. And while it's true that some of our military bases have their own power and water supplies, most rely on at least some services that are provided outside of the wire. This is, of course, not a new phenomenon. It used to be that our power projection in the domains of warfare could extend an umbrella of protection to these critical facilities. Our Army tacticians considered the placement of power plants in their battles, while our Navy planners kept ports clear of enemy submarines and mines. In cyberspace, extending nation-state protections to commercial assets are key for military missions is simply not possible. Setting aside the significant challenges of legal authorities and civil liberties, the expertise of how to best defend these systems in cyberspace does not rest with military officials. The people who best know the physical battle space around a power plant are the local authorities and military units who would defend it in case of an invasion. The people who best know the cyber battle space are the IT professionals who work at the plant, who literally built the networks themselves. This is not to say there is nothing the government can do to protect these facilities. We can share sensitive intelligence. We can work with them to evict malicious actors once they've been discovered. And we, as governments, should do those things, but fundamentally, the people on the front lines of conflict in the cyber domain will, in many, if not most cases, be civilians. And that is a fundamentally different paradigm than how we have traditionally approached homeland defense. And addressing that new paradigm is literally my job. Chris Inglis, our nation's inaugural national cyber director, approached me the day after the Ukraine invasion to ask me to be his second in command. He was building something new, an office within the White House that focused on bringing coherence to United States cybersecurity policy. The watchword of my office, the Office of the National Cyber Director, which I lead, is coherence, because the breadth of this new paradigm, the still young field of cybersecurity, it applies across the national government where every agency needs to defend itself against cyber intrusions. It applies to our critical infrastructure, whether in support of military missions or other national critical functions. It applies to our consumers, the everyday individuals at home who want to be able to bank and shop and talk to their friends online. And it applies to our allies and partners who believe in the rules-based international order and treasure stability in cyberspace. When President Biden released the United States' new national cybersecurity strategy 3 months ago, he recognized that the only way to achieve coherence across these disparate mission sets was to start with a positive vision of what we want cyberspace to be. And as leaders in the national security space, we far too often posture ourselves in opposition to the threats we face. But cyberspace is too broad, too pervasive, and too malleable for that kind of reactive posture to work. Letting an adversary dictate our focus gives them the initiative and lets them determine the terms of engagement. Instead, we need to agree on what we want the internet to be and then chart the path to get there. That means embracing not just national security equities, but economic security, innovation, and equality of opportunity in our hyper-connected world. Our fundamental insight is that cybersecurity is merely a means to an end. We don't do it for its own sake. We do it because in order to have the future we want, one with plentiful clean energy, amazing new medicines, and economic prosperity underpinned by connectivity, we need to build a secure foundation. Cybersecurity is a supporting function, and it's an absolutely essential one. With that positive vision in mind, the two major strategic shifts we call for are almost self-evident. First, because cyber operations scale so successfully, we must leverage scalable ways to improve our security. That means shifting more of the responsibility for cyber defense to those cyber enablers who have the wherewithal to act and are able to do so across a broad spectrum of the ecosystem. Today, we often devolve responsibility for cybersecurity downward to individual users and consumers. And as a result, a single misconfigured account or phishing email can spiral into a breach with devastating consequences. Just look at the Colonial Pipeline incident in 2021. This is exactly backwards. We cannot, nor should we expect that everyone needs to be a cybersecurity expert to participate in our vision for the internet. So how do we shift this burden? One way is by adjusting the shared responsibility model for information and communication technology service providers. We do not propose abolishing the model, for there will always be risk decisions best left in the hands of tenants who know their data and operations. But we do need to set baseline requirements, the proverbial seatbelts and airbags of the cloud, so that key features like logging are not profit add-ons, but instead come standard. We also need to make configuration securities secure by default. If it takes a dedicated team to securely configure your cloud instance, we're doing something wrong. We also need to raise our expectations for software manufacturers. Today, there is an immense business interest in taking on technical debt in the race to get a product to market and into the hands of users. The consequences of that technical debt, of not making secure architecture choices at the outset, are borne by users and, by extension, society far more than by software developers. Our strategy proposes imposing accountability, including through liability regimes, to align the incentives of technology makers with technology users. The entire ecosystem benefits when there are fewer vulnerabilities in code bases, and those that are found are quickly patched by mature vulnerability management programs. Our second strategic shift derives from the other new paradigm on cyberspace, the fact that companies are on the front lines of conflict. Even as we improve the cybersecurity of the components and services of our digital ecosystem, we need to recognize that there will be residual risk. And addressing that risk requires investments in resilience for the critical infrastructure providers that support military missions, as well as public health and safety. I have heard resilience sometimes described as the enemy of efficiency, and there's something to that description. But over the last several decades, we have seen the market aggressively move to increased efficiency with practices like just-in-time manufacturing. We have seen substantial economic benefits from these innovations, but we have also paid the price when a global pandemic froze supply chains and caused economic turmoil, and we're still feeling today. Recognizing that market forces may not inherently support increased resilience, we, the government, need to be prepared to intervene to incentivize investment. In our strategy, we propose multiple methods to do so. We are currently exploring a government cyber insurance backstop to help rapidly mature the insurance market and leverage insurers' risk pricing to drive companies to improve their practices. The Biden-Harris administration has also pushed out new regulations in key sectors, from transportation to water, to ensure critical infrastructure providers are meeting baseline cybersecurity requirements. And fundamentally, we will continue to look for ways to ensure that entities choose to make long-term investments in their cybersecurity, just as Estonia and NATO did in 2007, with the creation of this center. That, in a nutshell, is our strategy. We have many strategic objectives spread across 5 pillars, and we will soon be releasing an implementation plan that I'm incredibly excited about. But those 2 shifts in the service of a positive vision for cyberspace are where all other recommendations are derived from. But as I wrap up here, I want to bring that strategic vision back to the core NATO principles we'll be discussing throughout this conference. First and foremost, we need to recognize that mission assurance depends on the private sector, and that the military or Ministry of Defense won't be able to achieve its ends without partnering with other parts of the government. I think that there is a temptation to think that extending the military's protective umbrella to critical infrastructure essential for defense is the best course of action. And while I recognize the appeal of a Ministry of Defense being able to take action largely unilaterally to protect its interests, I respectfully disagree with this approach. The problem is just too big. Our systems are just too interconnected for the military to be able to effectively defend all that it relies on. And for instance, even if you could bring a power plant under the wing of a cyber command, what about the water facility it relies on to cool its turbines? What about the telecommunications company that both need to run their operations? And what about the multitude of suppliers that have some sort of trust relationship with all three entities? You can bet our adversaries are looking for the weakest link in that chain to exploit. And the only way I see for us to achieve our mission assurance needs is for ministries of defense to band together with their CERTs, their ministries of home affairs, their prime minister's offices to lift up the entire ecosystem. The clean energy future that animates so many governments today can also be a more secure one that makes it much harder for an adversary to knock out power to a military base. I hope you will return home after CyCon and talk with your fellow ministries, and at least as importantly, your private sector partners, about how, by working together, you can make it so malicious actors have to beat all of us to beat one of us. Finally, I hope we will apply our learnings on resilience in our interactions with our friends in Ukraine. As we continue to support their courageous efforts, I hope we will collectively convert the fierce urgency of this moment into investments in our cybersecurity architectures that will reduce our long-term risk. We are committed to a shared vision of peace and stability in cyberspace, and we must live up to that commitment by securing Ukrainian networks, even in the face of brutal Russian aggression. I feel like my discussion of the United States cybersecurity strategy may not have lived up to CyCon's theme this year of meeting reality. The caricature of strategies is that they sit on a shelf and collect dust, not that they're actually actualized. But as I said before, for me, the most exciting page of our strategy is the very last one, where we talk about implementation. And we are now well underway. I do hope that my intervention will provide some strategic scaffolding for the much more nuanced conversations that are to come, and that our approach will provide some food for thought once you return home. Thank you again for your attention this morning, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Ms. Walden, for your truly inspiring and very clearly delivered speech at this year's CyCon. I do understand that you are willing to answer one or two questions.
Absolutely.
And I understand from the organizers that we do actually have time. So if there's anyone from the audience who'd like to pose a question, let's see. Yeah, Claire, you have one. So I'll just step off stage then.
Okay.
Thank you, Henrik. Thank you for a great presentation of the Biden-Harris administration's national cybersecurity strategy. I think the idea of having a positive, proactive approach in cyberspace is the right one, which empowers us to promote and defend our values. Mm-hmm. I was particularly interested to hear what you said about software providers, and indeed some stakeholders have been asking for quite some time the idea that we should really consider software liability seriously. Mm-hmm. And you yourself say that often the priority is to get a product to market for the best price. How does the Biden-Harris administration see squaring that circle of potentially increasing costs, increasing development time to market, with the fact that many end users and companies still look for price and speed over security? Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for that question. Yes, software liability is one of the tools that we are looking at in order to shift market incentives in this space. The thought that a cyber attack is costlier than the cost of secure software is what motivates this in my mind. We've done it before. We've done it with car manufacturing, where we have the final assembler of a car liable for the whole car and for the piece parts. But we also have provided in the past safe havens for liability for those that build security with baseline requirements in mind. And so the software liability approach that we intend to explore, first, will not be easy. The word easy doesn't show up in the strategy or in our implementation plan. But second, it will be a balanced approach when we do finally figure out the framework for this. The idea, however, is that we can't normalize constant patching of software. I feel that we've done that. What we do need to normalize is secure to market. It's investing in our security so that we're not producing costlier breaches. That's the idea. But I do admit it's not easy. It's going to take a multi-stakeholder approach. It's going to require safe havens. It's going to require, perhaps in the US, our Congress's help. But we should be able to get there.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, one, sorry.
Good morning, ma'am. What do you view as the future of capacity building as it relates to NATO and with regard to Pillar 5 from the new national strategy?
So thank you for your question. So Pillar 5, for those of you who have not read our strategy as carefully as this gentleman, is our international pillar. It recognizes that international cooperation and capacity building is key to delivering that positive approach to the internet. The entire strategy, pillars 1 through 4, were also crafted with an international scope in mind. But we created that pillar 5 as an API, essentially, for our State Department to craft an international cybersecurity strategy. But the tenets of that are looking at the immediacy of international cooperation, but also what are the strategic investments that we need to make. And following the leadership of the center, part of that is capacity building, so that at the end of the day, we have an ecosystem recognizing that borders are almost non-existent in the digital ecosystem, recognizing that the United States cybersecurity is fully dependent upon Colombia's cybersecurity, for example. And so the State Department is crafting objectives and methodologies for recognizing capacity building and the U.S.'s participation in that process, along with our allies and close partners.
Thank you. I don't think we have time for more questions, but thank you so much for your interesting keynote. And on behalf of the Center, please accept this small token. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.